tonight's program featuring two Vermont authors, Melanie Finn and Makenna Goodman, who will discuss their books and the writing life in general. I'm Kathy Beard of the Norman Williams Public Library, and before we begin, we must visit a few housekeeping bits. All of tonight's technical aspects will be in the hands of our program director, Meg Brazil, who is working behind the scene. Although your videos and microphones have been turned off, we do want to hear from you. Please use the chat and the Q&A button, usually found at the bottom of your screen, to ask questions, make comments, or let us know of any tech problems. We will monitor the comments or questions to make sure that they are received by the authors to respond to at the end of the program. Melanie Finn is an author, screenwriter, and co-founder of a Tanzanian-based healthcare charity. Her books have received much acclaim. New York Times Notable Books of 2016, a finalist for the Orange Prize, and shortlisted for the Guardian's Not the Booker. Her most recent book, The Hare, is a story of a young woman who finds herself in rural Vermont cabin with her daughter after being abandoned by her cruel, domineering lover and must find ways to survive. Makenna Goodman, also based in Vermont, is a former editor of books on agriculture and food. Her debut book, The Shame, was named a Harvard Review Favorite Book of 2020, a Literary Hub recommended read, and a Boston.com book club pick, among other accolades. The Shame is a funny, thought-provoking debut about a woman in isolation, the choices we don't make, the choices we do make, motherhood and sacrifices. I really love that this will be a conversation format between these two wonderful authors, which makes one feel like we're all just sitting around the living room. But actually, I guess that's what we're going to do. We're so excited to hear from you both. So welcome, Melanie and Makenna.
Hi.
Hello.
Here we are.
Here we are. Hi, Makenna.
Hi, Melanie. It's so nice to be here with you.
You too. You managed to get your sorted out. You're in a different room now.
Yeah, that my Wi-Fi cut out and I sprinted, almost falling down the stairs to a different building. And here I am where I am. It's all going to work out. So
I know, right? Well, I think this is where we are as Vermont authors. It's like the authenticity. It has to do with, like as I said earlier, I'm in my husband's office, which is actually a closet where we have the laundry. And I have to shift because there's the light in the window where the Wi-Fi comes in. So anyway, so Makenna, thanks so much for agreeing to do this with me. And
yeah, congratulations on your wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yours is more recent, so I feel like more celebratory for you, just in the kind of aftermath of publication. How has it been going for you? I mean, you're a veteran. You've published many books, and
yeah. So this is my fourth. But it always feels different. And of course, this, as with you, this happened in the pandemic. So you kind of had to like reinvent the whole way of book touring, I guess, which is why we've invented this amazing Zoom thing, which I think is definitely gonna hang around. So yeah, just it's actually gone really well. I think that the book, probably the same with yours. I mean, mine really hit a nerve. I think with a lot of women, partly because I started writing it under Trump. And so a lot of that anger and sense of oppression has sort of surfaced in the book. And I think that's really had a lot of reaction. So, both good and bad. And probably like you, I've done a lot of book clubs, which I find really helpful in terms of getting like feedback from the people. So when did yours actually come out, Makenna?
It came out August of 2020.
Right. So in the middle of the pandemic, when we didn't even know it was going to happen. So how was that? Like, what was that experience like?
It was actually really lovely. Being in rural Vermont and having kids and a job, it was going to be a challenge to go on book tour anyway, just in terms of life, etc. And I found it quite enjoyable to be in my sweatpants and my bedroom doing book tour from my desk. And I do think it opened me up to actually more opportunity as a debut author to have conversation partners who were like, yeah, sure. Like, yeah, I'll do it. Like, what else am I going to do? I'm in lockdown. And yeah, and it's interesting. Actually, I've been thinking, I just finished your book last night and, or 2 nights ago. And there were so many things that stuck out to me that felt like so Vermont, like I hadn't thought of myself, since I haven't lived in Vermont my whole life. I've only been here for 12 years. I don't think of myself as a Vermont author. You know what I mean? Everybody, it's in my bio, I guess, but I don't think of myself. But when I read your book, I thought, oh God, like maybe we are Vermonters because like just like the character of the wood stove in your book, and just these kind of like this very kind of isolation as a way of life, not as this thing that happened to all of us that we're all enduring, but a kind of like way of life that exists outside of crisis, that sort of is its own reality. Anyway, I've been thinking a lot about that, about how what might have felt individual or Vermont. Sorry, you may hear my children yelling because I can't.
Don't worry,
my
mine are about to start cooking supper, so we'll see what happens in the background.
I don't know if you can hear them through the headphones. It's not foolproof. Anyway, blah blah blah. I don't know what I was saying, but I'd love to hear. I'd love to read a little bit of your book, if that's okay. I know we had talked about just introducing our conversation with some of reading each other's work. Would it be okay if I started with yours?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. And I think that what you were saying about the Vermont thing, we both live in a fairly similar way. We live in really rural communities, which are very closely knit, obviously. And that means that we're deeply connected to the seasons. And, Vermont has these really, really powerful seasons. Yeah. So I don't think that you can live here and write about being here unless you're acutely aware of like when the ramps come up and when the black flies come out. But yeah, okay, Makenna, so you go first, and then I've got a reading from your book.
Okay. Do you mind for people who haven't read your book yet to give like a short summary of what it is before I read your words?
Sure. So the Hare is the story of Rosie Monroe, who is starts out the book as a young woman of about 18, who's been raised in Lowell, Massachusetts. She's had an extremely unhappy childhood. Her parents died, and so she's been raised by her grandmother, who's an overwhelmed woman herself, struggling to pay rent, who takes in boarders, one of whom is an abuser of Rosie. And Rosie gets a scholarship. She wins a scholarship to Parsons School of Design in New York, and where she soon meets an older man, Bennett, who's about 20 years older than her. And she falls under Bennett's spell. He's very sophisticated and very suave. He has access to the moneyed elite of the Connecticut Gold Coast, and he takes Rosie off to live in a boathouse on this huge estate in Southport, Connecticut. And, Rosie's just an innocent young person and has no idea who Bennett is, though we as the reader begin to suspect that he's a bit of a shit. But it takes Rosie some time to figure that out. And at some point towards the first half of the book, end of the first half of the book, Bennett appears in the middle of the night, and he and Rosie and their daughter have to make a run for it with cop cars in pursuit. And they end up in Vermont at a sort of broken down farmhouse that Bennett somehow seems to have the keys to. And at this point, Bennett basically vanishes. He leaves Rosie to take care of herself and their young daughter in this remote place with no firewood and no money. So Rosie makes friends with a neighbor called Billy, who's a strange character but wonderful. And Billy basically helps Rosie become self-sufficient. So that's the first bit of the book. And then basically Bennett boomerangs back into their lives. And every time he comes, he trails some new disaster until eventually Rosie has to make a decision about whether she can carry on with this man or not and what she's going to do about it. And the last part of the book is Rosie in middle age, still living in this house, and her life in a very still place. And the past kind of comes back to set it all in disarray again. And she has to make some new decisions about what she's going to do, how she's going to move on. So that's the long summary. So
Well, here's the beautiful cover.
so pretty, so beautiful. I love that cover.
Well, okay, so I'm going to read your words.
Yes.
I love this idea. And this is on page 94, so it's in kind of the early starts. There's so many places that I underlined that I wanted to read aloud, but this stuck out to me as a good section. So the cold came without warning. The cold came at noon, a storm bending down from Canada in the first days of October. The morning had been warm, almost balmy, and Rosie had the windows open, letting in the yeasty smell of dry leaves, the moist life smell of the cows from miles away. For at last, she was banishing the sour musk of mouse piss from the house. She had cleaned each room over weeks while Bennett was at work, at first with squeamish trepidation, but now with the cunning and indifference of a seasoned hunter, she had set traps. Snap, 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 the traps went in the night, like gnashing teeth, and she'd find the soft, tawny bodies in the morning, heads clamped, small eyes slightly popped, whiskers stiff. Death had been quick. Twice, though, mice had been caught by their back legs. The first one Rosie had thrown outside in the long grass, alive and still in the trap. She'd been repelled by her cruelty, and then amazed at how quickly she'd forgot the suffering she could not see. The second mouse had peered up at her, bereft of self-pity, neither fearful nor pleading. Tiny leg bones poked through the gray fur. Rosie'd taken the fire poker and smashed in its head. The cold came on a silver sledge of cloud. Within an hour, the sun had vanished and the wind began, mean and prying, so that Rosie soon knew how thin were the walls of the house. You've got no insulation. And how the doors were not flush in their frames and windows loose on their sashes. The roof lacked sufficient nails, as did the siding on the north side. Something clanged, but she could not find it. The wind laughed and howled and danced and drummed, a band of gypsies surrounding the house, trying to get inside not for profit but for jest. The wind came through the cracks like knives. Then the rain lashed, the kind of hard rain that in summer lasted only minutes, but here, now, lasted for hours. The house leaked, and Rosie ran from room to room with pans and buckets as Miranda clapped her hands and gurgled to see such fun. So beautiful. Such poetry.
Oh, well, thanks. I'm glad you like that. I'm glad you like that part. I think for Rosie, of course, it's a difficult landing, but I love her because she prevails and she perseveres. And by the time she finally leaves the house, she's made friends with it. So I felt really good about that. So I'm going to read now from Makenna's book. So Makenna, if you would like to tell a little bit about your book, I will turn to page. Got to put my right 20,
Okay.
21, 22, I think.
Yeah, so the shame is here is it takes place over the course of one day in a woman's life. She the story begins with her driving away from her family in the middle of the night. She lives in rural Vermont and she's driving towards New York City. Well, you find that out later. But as she drives, she pieces together what brought her to this moment, through recollections, memories stitched together, that kind of develops into, you learn what led her to leave her family in the middle of the night. And basically, she lives on a homestead, a very ethical life that she sort of has orchestrated in a way so she's living close to her deepest beliefs. Her husband is a successful philosophy professor. He gets all the glory. She's at home dealing with the kids, dealing with the sheep, etc. And she has no community, so she's reading lots of books at night, and she realizes that actually the women whose books inhabit her mind in the latter hours of the day are her community. And in order to be a part of this community, she must write a book as well, a novel, in order to be in conversation with these women. And so she does, and she begins an artistic process that liberates her and that gives her a sense of purpose, where she can play and be free, I suppose, even though she's perfectly free in her life, but just to let herself go. And in order to make the book not just a retelling of her own life, she finds a woman online to use as a model for character development, in order to project her experience onto this potential character, and becomes obsessed with her, and loses herself. And it's sort of layers of stories that she loses herself in. So that's the general gist.
That's it. I'm just a second putting my phone on mute, because inevitably, as soon as I start reading, the one phone call of the day is gonna come in, and right in the middle of reading. So there we go. Okay, so there's lots of questions that I actually had really wrapped around what Makenna just said, but I wanted to read this section. So at this point in the book, the main character, and I'm just trying to think, do we ever know her name?
Alma,
that's right, because the husband is Asa. You're right. Sorry about that. Because I got so involved in like being inside her that like her actual name seemed to be completely irrelevant, because I never saw her from the outside. I always was so deep within herself. So in this scene, Alma has, as Makenna said, Asa has just been given tenure at the college, and so they're going to this very smart dinner, and Alma has taken a lot of care to get dressed and to prepare herself both physically and mentally for this very, very serious posh dinner with all these very highfalutin people. And so she's sitting at the table, and the food is coming out, and she's really enjoying herself. She's had a glass of wine. And so this picks up about halfway through the dinner. Yes, I was winning them all over. Our discussion was the perfect combination of agreeability and combativeness. The salad came and went. I challenged conservative assertions in just the right tone, and could see I made some of the wives stop and think when discussing the merits of public versus private education. What was a better choice, blessing the under-resourced public school with your presence and thinking that was enough to address the problems of segregation, or creating a radical, inexpensive, non-dogmatic private school to show the public sector their model wasn't working and give them an example of one that might? We spoke of hunting and the politics of ecological agriculture, and I went on for some time about nutrient density and the difference between merely organic food and that which is deeply nourishing on a micronutrient level. There's a big difference. A carrot is not just a carrot. At my suggestion, we even played the "which dessert are you" personality game, my favorite, a gamble to be sure, but it went over really well. Everyone was so relaxed. I was a breath of fresh air to them, you could tell. I wasn't faking this, mind you. Yes, I'd had to read some back issues, but they had always been around. I was the one who had subscribed to them in the first place. A lot of this was, in fact, my area of interest. And while I might not have had success in the world of the written word, I wasn't a pudding, though in the dessert game, of course, I was. This was an important exercise for me, knowing that I still had a brain. I still had something to give. I began to feel as if I too had been offered the promotion. Ace's boss, the president, chocolate person, very picky, laughed with me about something, elbowing me in the arm as if we had known each other since the good old days. And the wife of the chair of the medieval studies department invited me to a private meditation group at her guest house on Sunday mornings. She was a classic pie person, and we found out about her top secret recipe for the flakiest crust, something pie people always do, try to convert you. I had another glass of wine. The conversation kept flowing. I could have stayed all night. Everyone was focused on me, amazed at how much I knew considering I wasn't a professional woman, how I was the only stay-at-home mom at the table who didn't hire someone to clean her house, who gardened, who raised sheep, who dabbled in freelance work, who was an artist, who knew that painting is not just drawing with paint, but the placement of color next to color, who had time to read long-form journalism while taking care of 2 kids and making dinner every night, sewing patches on pants instead of buying new pairs. I could see a glimmer of envy in the others' wives' faces when I discussed the projects and nature hikes I organized for my kids, the forts we built, the way they used real knives to cut real vegetables. Yes, eyes were on me, and my audience was speechless, it seemed, as I digressed and divulged exactly how to make sauerkraut. It's all about process, but it's actually quite simple. After a while, I discovered that yes, all eyes were on me. The interest and admiration in the other wives' eyes didn't seem right exactly. Could it be that it was closer to horror? What had I said? Oh shit! Had I said something wrong? Had I joked about homeschoolers in a pejorative way, not knowing that someone's cousins were unschooling their kids on a nearby farm? Had I brought up vaccinations or astrology? Oh God, had I? And then the head of admissions, who was sitting directly across from me, stifled a laugh as he covered his mouth. His wife, cake person, sugar fiend, slapped him on the shoulder. I took a breath and reached for my glass of water to buy some time, to slow down and regroup. But my hands, I found, were occupied. Distracted by my own pontificating, I had been, for who knows how long, but clearly long enough, cutting the president's filet mignon. And when I looked down at his plate, I could see that I had done a very good job indeed. The pieces were spaced evenly apart and in neatly arranged cubes, just large enough to spear with a fork, but not too big to choke on. So, so what I loved about this, and it just encapsulated so much about the story for me, which is that we're sympathetic with her because we've all been there when we think like, God, I'm so clever, I'm so amazing. And then you suddenly have like this wash of doubt where you think, oh my God, I'm an idiot. But what you've done really well in this novel is you've taken this person who's utterly self-obsessed, right? I mean, she's a wonderful mother and she's a great wife, but within that, she's completely obsessed with herself and her thoughts and how she's living and the minutiae of her day. And yet you've still made this really compelling, riveting person. Like I loved being with her, even though she's so intensely focused on herself. And this scene just lays that out so perfectly, that she has no awareness of what's going on around her, really only her own like mental, physical, and emotional process is the only thing that's kind of, surfacing in her at all. So I really, plus it's just really funny. So, and it's just a great piece of kind of stream of consciousness writing that kind of ends in this really neat like plate of perfectly cut food. So I love that section.
It's funny when you read it, I thought to myself, I sort of wish that he would choke on the meat. I don't know. It's interesting because I was thinking as you were saying that, because so much of, a lot of what you just said, I think to myself, it's true. My book is about the psychic process. It's about the psyche and about the tricks that the mind plays on itself and the stories that people tell themselves about their own life. Mm-hmm. And then you so what really happens in your life, and then the story that you tell yourself about what happens in your life, and then how that story takes on a life of its own, and then to be a writer on top of that, the creation of a false story or a fake story that's inevitably intertwined with reality. Because I mean, that's my belief. I don't think that anything can just be fabricated out of nowhere. It is my belief that things bubble up from the subconscious regardless of how much you try to make things up or imagine them. And I was thinking about your book and how the relationship between Rosie and Bennett, her sort of horrible lover who is entirely unworthy of any of her attentions, and then the relationship that she has with her friend Billy, who is actually a woman, but doesn't necessarily embody the feminine archetype, shall we say. And I was just thinking about when I wrote, I was thinking of all the different aspects of, like, all the characters in my book actually are just projections of the main character.
Mm-hmm.
And in your book, one of my questions was like, so much of your novel has to do with the relationship women have within a heteropatriarchal society. And I was just curious about your relationship as a writer to like masculinist narratives, or and how your writing has evolved within their context, if that makes sense. Like that power was just, I kept thinking about power in your book.
So it's funny that you bring that up, because I have two questions, because actually on page 77 you write this really interesting thing, and it happens to be something that I've been thinking a lot about. You say your Ace is talking, and he says, he told me the classical stories we draw from all have roots in the male quest for dominance, and perhaps the reason we are so interested in retelling them is the hope that a newer permutation will somehow make the underlying truth more bearable, that those in power want to use people for their own gain. So I underlined it, and I've had like questions about that, right? Because one of the things I really have been thinking about is this idea of the novel as this form that is kind of quite constrictive, in that, and elsewhere you write, that an event has to happen, otherwise it's just a blog or it's just journaling. So we've created this structure that we have to abide by as writers. And yet, does that mean we're actually just fulfilling this kind of patriarchal, this kind of like patriarchal form that like, if you just left it to women and said, well, go away and write a book, like, would we even know where to begin that hadn't begun in this very masculine way of telling stories? So I don't know the answer to that, but I was really curious about like where this line about, came from in you, and like what you were thinking about when you wrote it in this book.
Let me think. Let me try and remember. No, I'm just kidding. I think I know. Okay, so I mean, I guess I'm interested in the way in this book in particular, I was interested in the way the mind unravels and then winds itself back up. And I was thinking about, just in terms of how we interpret as people, how we interpret what is happening in our lives, and the power of perspective and the power of judgment and the lens with which you choose to see the world. And I guess, I mean, this is an inherently classist statement, because it's totally dependent on my own education and what I grew up reading and listening to, and the stories that I told myself about the world. But but I would say that, okay, I'll say, I'm trying to answer this. I'm like analyzing myself in this way that I don't really, that's not really working for me. Okay, so The Shame is actually a retelling of the Eros and Psyche Greek myth.
Okay.
I was fascinated by Greek myths as a child. My father read them to me. I found them fascinating, and I found, as I like developed in my education, lots of things circled back to the classical Greek myths and this idea of like archetypes. And I read a book of psychoanalytic theory after I had my second child that was written in the early 80s by this Jungian analyst who actually deconstructed the myth of Eros and Psyche and narrativized it. Basically, his theory was that, in fact, the myth is all projections of what he called the archetypal woman, and that, in fact, the god of love was not actually her like amazing royal immortal husband, but her masculine projection, like her animus, her masculine side that was projected onto him as a character. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who you might traditionally think of as the mother-in-law figure in the myth, she's the mother of the god of love. In fact, she was the goddess projection of Psyche, who's the main character. And when I read that, I thought, well, if you can look at your life as just a series of projections of yourself and create characters from then then I might be able to create an order that I can exist in that is within my own control, as opposed to, say, I don't know, like the dinner party scene, like she's a loser because she isn't a professor, she isn't getting the promotion. So I guess I feel like we take certain structures for granted and then we define them and extrapolate from that definition without questioning the root of them, the root of where those stories come from. So for me, I was playing with the root of something as a sort of inside out. But it's funny because I also underlined in your book, you said, I forget exactly what they were talking about. They were talking about art in the beginning of the book, Rosie and Bennett. And he says, Rosie Monroe, why do you know so much about art? And she says, I'm at Parsons. And he says, Rosie Monroe, you should read less and do more. And she says, I like the reading. Art is history, not battles and kings, but the history of how people interpret the world. And anyway, I'm not very good at the doing. I don't know. I kept hearing like echoes of my thoughts in your book. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess, okay, so here's my next question. One of the descriptions that has been used to describe your book, I forget it, I was reading some of your press clips, as a cautionary fairy tale is what someone said. And when I read those words today, like when I read them, I was thinking, are those words ever used to describe books authored by men or books with male narrators? I so often when I hear about books with female narrators or that are about being a woman, there's this kind of like fantastical, like the critical media wants to put it into this category of magic or fantasy or fairy tale or fable, and because it delivers moral questions, like because the work of art delivers moral questions. But I rarely hear about male authored books as fairy tales or cautionary tales, and it reminds me of witches. I'm just curious what you think about fairy tales and fable.
I mean, I guess I don't really think of it as a fairy tale, but what I am interested in is that so many people, tell me it's so angry, there's so much anger, Rosie, you must be really angry. And I'm always so surprised at that, because then again, how many men's books do we ever hear about, like, oh God, he's really angry. If you read a novel, right, there's never this accusation that somehow this idea of rage. And there's a lot coming up now about female rage. It's like, well, okay, well, female rage is women getting pissed off and raising their voices. Like male rage is like going into a shopping mall and killing people with a gun. But so I do find, like, of course, that as a woman writing about women, there's this kind of tiptoeing. I mean, men are really nervous about reading my book. My husband has not read it. And they react very differently to it. They're very, I wouldn't say offended, but they're like, is this really how you think about men? Or why are there no nice male characters in the book? And the point is that if you are someone like Rosie, who is someone like me, and you have these foundational experiences in which you're abused by men, you make horrible choices on the men in your life. Like, it takes years to be able to meet nice men and have real relationships. So of course, all your founding relationships are with idiots like Bennett, because they're the people who make sense to you. So it is interesting. And I do think that all the characters in my book are, as you say, I mean, you write on so many levels. We all write on so many levels. There's the story level where you're just trying to tell a really good story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it all makes sense. You're trying to write beautifully. We're trying to also be artists with our prose and create a sense of mood and belonging with our words. But we're also writing, yes, on this very deep conscious level of archetypes. And when I look at all the women in this book, they are various kinds of women, of the same woman. You have Billy, who has completely given up her femininity. She's taken off the coat of her femininity. She said, this isn't something that I want. It's not useful. And then you have Christiane, who has decided to become a woman and is struggling with what that means. So, and then you have, even the grandmother, who has sort of become this desperately oppressed and obligated woman, who Rosie, in a sense, is destined to become, except she flails against that and becomes, to me, utterly heroic. So in the end of the book, I think Rosie becomes the heroine. But moving on from that, because we both write these very intimate books and we live in small communities, like, how do you deal with the fact that people think you're writing about yourself? Because you are writing about yourself, but you're not writing about yourself. So how do you play that? Like, where do you find that line? And do you feel comfortable or uncomfortable that people think, oh, you had a crush on some blogger in New York? I mean,
it's interesting. My book came out in lockdown, and it's my first. So I haven't really been in my community as a published writer in the way that you have over the course of years. It's not really my identity yet here. I'm still kind of shut away. And I think that, yeah, I guess I would say my interest in, I guess I don't really care that much what people think about me, because I already feel like like I stick out like a sore thumb, and I sort of, I don't really care. It's interesting. My husband, often people come up to him and say, like, I'm so sorry that she did that to you, that she portrayed you in such a way. And he's like, oh, no, that's not me. That's her. All of the characters are her. And they're like, oh, I get it. But I suppose I'm much more interested. I'm interested in that discussion, because what I get excited about when talking about literature, and this isn't the case for everyone, certainly, is I don't believe really in made up. And so I think that everything is real. Everything is based on one's life, but that doesn't mean it's true. It's just that's the way I think people live, and the way they write, and the way they make art, and the way they teach, and the way they walk, that there's no hiding from our humanness. And so I'm intrigued by that concept. And I think people who want to reduce a work of art to, this is you, did this really happen? I sort of just laugh and move on, because it's kind of beside the point. But I don't know. What about you?
Oh no, my brother-in-law, because my last book, The Underneath, opens with this journalist following her husband, and their marriage is very fractious, following her husband into a basement. There's some noise down there, and she's holding a hammer, and she fantasizes about smashing his head in with the hammer. And my brother-in-law like accosted me, goes, I was offended. And I'm like, why, Danny? Why were you offended? He goes, I know that's how you think about Matt. I could recognize the house. I said, our house does not have a basement. Like, this is a guy who studied history at Oxford. It's like, Danny, fiction, and then fiction, fact. And then Matt, my husband, was like, he's just talking about his own relationship because he wants to smash his own wife's head in.
Right.
But it's true. Like, I am aware that people look at me, not so much because of what the characters do, but that I'm capable of coming up with this kind of really dark stuff, like what happens to Bennett. So it's not so much do they think I'm like using my characters as avatars, but like, oh my God, what is going on in that woman's head? Should we let our kids have a play date there? It's sort of like,
interesting.
like letting your kids go to play with the weird people down the street who have a lot of guns. Like, it's just like,
Yeah.
but
That's interesting. I didn't think I interesting.
But Nadine Gordimer, who's like one of my favorite writers, and she wrote this great quote about like how writing is this nexus between the external world and the internal world, and how you're like you're always operating in this porous place in between, and how wonderful it is to be a writer in that you get to live all of these lives, because you only as a person in your body have one life to live, but you can take all these other journeys. And I fully, probably like you, Makenna, I mean, I'm fully inhabiting the body and the life of the character that I write. Like, that's my life until it's over, and then I come back to myself. It's maybe like being those really immersive actors like Daniel Day-Lewis who talk with an Irish accent or something. But I get really caught up in it, and I find sometimes it's quite difficult to step out of that and back into myself when I'm really deep in the writing process.
So I was going to ask you about your writing process, and it's interesting that I'm not sure that I relate to the process in the same way. And so I'm very curious about when you say you fully embody this other life, what does that look like? Do you come up with an idea and plot it out and then kind of like lose yourself in the character into like a description or a kind of like identity that you've mapped out for the character? Or what is the process like for you?
Well, I think that I start from a really emotional place. Like there's a theme I want to address. And in this case, I had been sexually abused as a child, and I had waited a really long time to write about it. I wanted to have distance from it so that I didn't feel like I was writing in it from a place of being a victim, but that I could look at the long term, like what happens 50 years after you've been an abused child, like where do you go, and having the perspective of looking back. So I came from this very emotional place, not really knowing where I would go, except that I wanted my character to feel this sense of intense liberation, which I did when I went through menopause. It was like all of that went away. And so I knew that was my character's journey. And I felt Rosie instinctively. I didn't, know exactly what was going to happen to her. I think that's the plot part, which is, structural as much as it is, just storytelling. But I think you have a feeling for your character. And like in your book, you hold so closely to the wind with your character. I never for a moment lose her sense, even as she's losing herself. I never for a moment lose her sense of her as a real person. And so, again, this is your first novel. So what was your starting point with this?
Well, I guess I would say that, well, so I'm now well into a second novel. So I can say that I think this is the way I do things for the moment because I'm doing it again. And for me, I think and think and think and think for a very long period. Well, not very long, but for a prolonged period of time without writing. And actually, Rachel Cusk, who is a writer who I really admire, also does this and has
I
talked
have to
about
say,
it.
so weirdly, when I was reading yours, it reminded me of, I haven't read Rachel Cusk for years, but it reminded me of early Rachel Cusk.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, I actually am pretty new to Rachel Cusk and didn't read her until after I wrote my book, and actually an editor who ended up rejecting my book said, this reminds me of Rachel Cusk. And I read it and I was like, oh my God, wow. And I'm actually very fascinated by a lot of what she says about writing and about process because I identify with it so much. And another friend of mine, Sheila Hetty, we all kind of have a similar way of writing, which is like thinking and thinking and thinking just about life, living life, not thinking about it in relation to writing. I'm talking about myself now, not about them.
Yeah.
Thinking, and then I have a journal by my bed, and I pretty much only write in bed, and it's late at night when everyone's asleep. And then I'll just have some sort of like spark. I'll be very mad about something, or I'll just have this sort of like pent up need to release. And then I'll just write and go and go and go and go and not stop. And that's usually like a period of a week, sometimes a day. And I won't read over it. And then I'll stop, and then I'll just think and think and live and live. And then if I have some spark, write again. And then I'll transcribe it, and then it starts to piece into something. And then I'll have an idea of like, oh, like putting, like I'll have the clothes laid out on the bed, and I'll pack them in a certain order into the suitcase, or I'll put them on hangers one by one. And then the story kind of unfolds from that hodgepodge of writing. So I guess it's sort of like quilting, I think of it. I don't quilt, but what I imagine quilting, where you assemble the squares of all the different kinds of fabric. And then when they've been assembled, you lay them out in the pattern and then stitch it all together at the end. And so I think for me, it's more of a psychological process of working through whatever issue I have or whatever theory I'm interested in through writing, as opposed to trying to create something from scratch, if that makes sense. And I don't know if that like makes any sense, but to me, I think maybe someday I'll just stop needing to write or wanting to write. When I write essays, it's different because it's much more like laborious and research heavy and just like all consuming, and with with like papers everywhere and just like racking my brain. But yeah, with fiction, I don't know, I'm just kind of brain dumping and then making sense of it later.
I mean, I think that coming from different places, I mean, I worked as a screenwriter, and I still do. And so obviously the story part is not primal, but like I'm really plot driven. Like I love murder mysteries. And it's like what I watch thrillers on TV, and I love like Agatha Christie. And so I've always been drawn to how you create a story as it with an engine, so that people are reading the story because they want to know what happens, and then hoping that I'm a good enough writer and create compelling enough characters that are real enough, like have real heart, and so that these two, the plot and the character, really move together. And what like that's the main difference, I would say, between your book and my book, is that mine is so much more plot driven, whereas yours is very much like this incredibly strong voice that just pulled me through simply by what you were saying in this character you created, because the plot itself is quite thin. It's just this person who's confused about how she can find a way to be in this world, and she kind of develops this crush on this woman in Brooklyn who represents everything that she isn't, and she kind of moves towards that inevitable place of going down to see her. And what amazed me is that you kept this momentum in this very interior space with a very thin plot. And I'm not meaning that in like,
Yeah.
I mean it as a compliment, because my books, sometimes I'm like, I think I just have drums and cymbals going. And, what would happen if I just quieted it down and like wrote about the relationship between Rosie and Billy and like just made that the story? But I also realized I'm actually just not that writer. Like I can't write with that kind of intimacy that someone like Rachel Cusk is so good at, and that you're good at. I'm much more a storyteller. Like I need the story. I need to figure things out. I need to have the plot and chart it on the wall. So
it's so interesting, this the way that we choose to make sense of the world and how much it differs person to person, and how books, I mean, I was going to ask you, and someone asked in the chat, what are our next books about? And feel free to ask any questions. I know that we have 5 minutes
coming down to time.
But I was I mean, you've talked about Nadine Gordimer, we've talked about Rachel Cusk, and I'm just curious, what other books do you love, or what other writers do you love that you read? Because I know everyone's always looking for great recommendations, and there's so many books, and it really is like there's room for them all, I think. And I'm curious what else you read. If you read poetry, your work is so poetic. Like your sentences, on a sentence level, you have such unbelievable depth and lyricism and voluptuousness in your writing. And I'm just curious, like, do you read poetry, or I don't know, like what are you reading?
Well, I think, motherhood definitely takes away huge amounts of reading time. It's like, what can I read in 10 minutes at night before I fall asleep?
Yeah.
I used to, when I was in my 30s, I read everything. I read so much, and I read so much poetry, Auden, and all like the classics, and I still love that. Like sometimes I'll go into my library and I'll be like, I just have to read this poem, but it depends. Like if I'm actually writing, I'm very careful to only read either nonfiction or detective stories.
Huh.
And then when I'm not writing, then I kind of really delve into whatever. I mean, anything, because as you say, I just love the fact that there's so many ways of putting words on paper and talking about ideas and expressing ideas. Like I read this amazing book called Shadowlands, which is about the Malheur wildlife refuge standoff that happened a couple of years ago. And the guy's a poet. He lives in Palm Springs or something. He's actually a poet. And when you read his book, even though it's nonfiction, you read the poetry, but as a sort of slice of life and understanding America, it's brilliant. And then, because I've been doing a lot of these Zoom sessions, I've been introduced to so many wonderful writers. It's been really, really great to read a lot of women's fiction, like modern women's fiction. So I've really been enjoying that. What about you, Makenna?
Well, yeah, same. Actually, I'm teaching now, and so I've been teaching a lot of poetry, just because they're short and and it's easy to kind of like pack it into a curriculum for high schoolers. And I have been reading a lot of great poetry and really finding, for the first time, actually really connecting with poems and with just that kind of, I think I'm just into condensing and condensing and condensing. I'm also an editor, and I think I just like condense. I don't know. I feel as though maybe maybe at some point I'll write poetry long from now, or just like I'm getting smaller and smaller and tighter. But I tend to like really short books. I'm finding like every time I love something, I look and I see it's very
Short.
I just read a book that actually comes out in a couple weeks by this Japanese writer, Mieko Kawakami, who I really love her work. And she's quite famous in Japan, and a very avant-garde feminist writer. And I don't know much about Japan, but I know that, you know, there's different, the feminism in Japan is a different, it's just different from here, obviously. And yet her latest book is called Heaven, and it's about two high schoolers who are bullied. They're both horribly bullied, and they find solace in each other. And it's one of the most beautiful books I've read in like the last several years. I absolutely loved it. So, oh, and so Barbara Barry says, what are our next books about? Should we say that before we end?
Yeah, we'll be quick if you can give us a few minutes, Kathy.
Oh, sure.
You go first, Makenna.
Oh, sure. So you go first. I have to figure out how to talk about it, because I have barely talked about it.
I mean, first of all, it's horrible to talk about a book before you start it, because you think like, oh God, the end product is always really different. But I had to make a decision between whether to write something that was based here or something that was based actually in California. So yeah, it's kind of a ghost story set up at a Lake Willoughby about two sisters in the 50s, and one goes missing, presumed dead, and the guilt in the surviving sister, and then there's another parallel story that happens in the present about a young girl who's about 13, who's kind of coming of age in the same house where all that happened. So there's, yeah, I mean, it's hard to describe. I mean,
it's early yet.
It's early, but some of the themes of the feminist themes are very much there, because I see my own daughters, you know, they're now 11, like how they are entering this adult world is really fascinating to me and terrifying at the same time. So that's really my preoccupation at the moment, and it very much, that's the theme that underlies this. So what about you, Makenna?
I'm really interested in, I think I keep picking at the idea of living on the land and the ethical implications of if you can choose to homestead or choose to grow your own food and do that labor, and what people, basically how the implications around class and access and choice play in to hard work. And so my next book is about that, is about a man. Actually, it's about a man, from the point of view of a man who's trying to find himself through work on the land, and how that kind of plays into his evolution. It's similar. I don't know. Anyway.
No, I think that we both have this connection to how characters interact with the landscape, and because we live so much part of that natural world, I can't imagine like growing up in a city or being in a city and not breathing in the seasons, and just like I think I would go insane. So,
I agree. Yeah. And I loved that about your book. I loved that about the way that the land and the seasons and the animals and the just the landscape was its own character and had its own, that was the foundation for me, what I kept coming back to. Anyway.
Yeah.
So nice
to
talk.
We could obviously go on. So sorry, Kathy, we'll have to end here, but
well, I wish you would go on. I mean, I feel badly having to come in, but I think this has been just one of the most marvelous programs that I've been part of. at least a participant or an appreciator of. And I wish we could do this again sometime. It's just, all I can say is wow. And I thank you both so much for sharing all that you've shared. And it's just been great. And I thank the audience too for coming and being with us. And would you ever come back again? I mean, maybe
Yeah.
you got your other books going or something. I would love this. I love this conversation. But thank you so much. And
Thank you.
get back to business now. So for the audience, we will be having on May 13th, we'll be having another program, another conversation about a different subject. Bill Colson, who is a Woodstock resident, will be talking to his longtime friend, Alexander Wolf, about Wolf's new book called End Papers. And it's the story of the Wolf family fleeing from Germany and their journey to the United States. And they ended up starting Pantheon Books, which and became huge publishers. So that please look at our website and in the newsletter and in listservs and stuff for more information about how to register for these events. But thank you all so much. This has just been the highlight of my day, week, month.
Mhm.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was an
Thank
honor.
you, Kathy. And thank you, Meg. And Makenna, it's been really great to meet you. I hope we get to see each other again.
Yeah, I think we must.
I agree. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.